Welcome to Life Stories, where we uncover moments that define humanity, stories of struggle, resilience, and transformation. Today, we bring you a gripping tale of justice and redemption that starts with a routine traffic stop and unravels into a profound journey of truth. This is the story of Marcus Reed, a respected judge who faces humiliation and prejudice, only to rise as a beacon of change. Stay with us as we explore the emotions, lessons, and power of standing up for what's right. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And let's dive into today's story. It was a sunny, serene afternoon in Brookfield Heights. The kind of day when everything feels slower and more peaceful. The small suburban town, with its manicured lawns and quiet streets, seemed far removed from the chaos of the outside world. I was on patrol. A routine shift that had become second nature after years on the job. My name is Ethan Davis, and I had always prided myself on being a man who could spot trouble from a mile away, or at least. That's what I told myself. As I cruised down the tree-lined streets, my thoughts drifted aimlessly until a sleek black car caught my attention. Something about it seemed off. It wasn't the car itself, really, but the driver. He wasn't someone I expected to see in this neighborhood, a middle-aged black man, sharply dressed, sitting confidently behind the wheel. My pulse quickened as my mind raced. It wasn't unusual for me to profile people based on instinct, or so I rationalized. And yet, that moment was different. I reached for the siren and flipped it on, signaling him to pull over. The car eased to the side of the road in a manner so calm it unnerved me. I stepped out of my cruiser, hand resting on my holster, and approached the driver's side window. Inside sat a man whose presence exuded composure. His hands were already on the wheel, his demeanor calm, almost patient, as if he had anticipated this interaction. License and registration. I barked, my tone sharp and authoritative. It was how I was trained to assert control. But this time, it felt heavier, laden with a tension I couldn't quite name. The man didn't flinch. He nodded slightly, retrieving his wallet and handing me his identification. As I scanned his license and documents, I couldn't stop myself from narrowing my eyes at him. "What's the problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady, respectful, but firm enough to make me feel like I needed to assert myself further. "You tell me," I shot back, leaning into the power dynamic. "What are you doing around here?" "I'm on my way home," he replied evenly, his gaze never wavering. "I live just a few blocks away." A few blocks away? My mind resisted the idea. I glanced back at the car, as if its glossy exterior might offer some hidden clue. "This your car?" I asked, my voice laced with suspicion. "Yes, it is," he replied, his expression neutral. But I couldn't let it go. There was something about the situation, about him, that made me dig deeper. "You sure about that?" I leaned closer to the window. "You don't look like you belong around here." For the first time, I saw his jaw tighten. But his tone remained calm. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. I'm on my way home. Is there a reason for this stop?" I ignored his question, unwilling to let go of the narrative I had already built in my mind. His calmness felt like a challenge, and I wasn't about to back down. "Step out of the car," I ordered, my hand now fully on my gun. He hesitated, and in that pause, I caught a glimpse of something I hadn't expected: sadness. Not fear, not defiance, but a deep, quiet sadness. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out onto the sidewalk. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," I instructed, my voice harder now, as if to mask my growing discomfort. "For what?" he asked, his tone measured but edged with irritation. "For resisting." I snapped. "You're not answering my questions." "I've answered every question you've asked," he said, his patience wearing thin. "I haven't broken any laws." The tension between us thickened as I took a step closer. Chest puffed out, fueled by something I couldn't quite articulate: ego, prejudice, the need to feel in control. I said, "Put your hands on the car." Reluctantly, he complied, placing his hands on the hood of his own car. I began patting him down, searching for anything that could justify what I already knew in my heart was an unjustified stop. But there was nothing. No weapons. No drugs. No stolen items. Just a man in a suit driving home. "What's your name?" I demanded, standing over him, still searching for a way to maintain my authority. He turned his head slightly, meeting my gaze with a look that was calm, unshaken, but carrying a weight I didn't yet understand. "Michael Reed." I froze for a moment. His name should have triggered something, but I shrugged it off, dismissing him as just another nobody. "Well, Mr. Reed, I'm going to run your license and see if there's anything on your record." He nodded silently, his composure unbroken. But I saw a flicker of fire behind his calm exterior. It wasn't defiance or anger, it was something deeper. Resilience. Perhaps. As I walked back to my cruiser, I felt the unease growing within me. It wasn't just his calmness that unsettled me, it was the quiet dignity with which he carried himself, even as I humiliated him. And yet, I pushed those thoughts aside. To me, this was just another stop. Just another chance to remind someone of their place. But Michael Reed wasn't just another man. And this was far from over. As I sat in my cruiser, the hum of the engine a low, constant noise in the background, I ran Michael Reed's license through the system. My eyes scanned the screen, waiting for some flag or outstanding warrant that could justify my actions. Nothing. His record was clean. He was, as he claimed, simply on his way home. I glanced up at him through the windshield. He stood by his car, his hands resting calmly on the hood. The late afternoon sunlight caught the shine of his shoes and the sharp cut of his suit. There was something about the way he stood unmoved by the stares from nearby windows, unshaken by my demands, that made me feel exposed, as though he saw right through me. Still, I wasn't ready to let it go. My pride wouldn't allow it. I stepped out of the cruiser, his license in hand, and approached him again, tossing the card onto the hood beside him. I said, "You're clear. But you're acting suspicious. Why were you driving so slow through this neighborhood?" He looked at me, his eyes steady and unreadable. I was obeying the speed limit. "Officer." There was nothing suspicious about it. I stepped closer, invading his personal space, my voice lowering. "You know, people who have nothing to hide don't get so defensive." He straightened, not backing away, but not rising to the bait either. "I'm not being defensive," he said firmly. "I've answered all your questions. I've complied with everything you've asked. There's no reason for this to continue." It wasn't his words that irritated me, it was the way he said them. Calm, measured, unafraid. It made me feel small, as though my authority, my badge, meant nothing. I couldn't stand it. "You don't get to tell me how this works," I snapped, my voice rising. "I ask the questions. You answer them." His jaw tightened, but his expression remained composed. He didn't respond, and the silence between us felt heavier than any words. I could feel my temper simmering, but I didn't care. In my mind, he was challenging my authority, and I wasn't going to let him win. "What are you hiding?" I demanded, stepping even closer. "Why don't you just come clean now? And this will go a lot easier for you." His eyes hardened. "I'm not hiding anything. I've done nothing wrong." I scoffed, a mocking smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "We'll see about that. Turn around and put your hands on the car." For a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes, a flash of frustration. Perhaps. Or exhaustion. Slowly, he shook his head. "Officer, there's no reason for this. I'm not under arrest. And you have no right to detain me." His words hit a nerve. Without thinking, I reached out and grabbed his arm. roughly turning him around and pressing him against the hood of the car. He winced slightly but didn't resist. "Is this necessary?" he asked. His voice strained but still calm. "I'm not resisting." "You are," I growled, pulling out my handcuffs. "Stop resisting." Within moments, his wrists were bound, and I began searching him again, my hands moving roughly over his suit. But there was nothing. No weapons. No contraband. No stolen goods. Just a man who had been driving home. The realization should have been a relief. But instead, it filled me with frustration. How dare he make me feel powerless? How dare he stand there with that calm expression? As if he were the one in control. "You think you're special." "Huh," I sneered, pulling him upright but keeping him in cuffs. "You think you can talk to me like that because you're wearing a suit?" He didn't respond. His silence wasn't submission, it was calculated. He was waiting. And it unnerved me. I didn't realize then that I was the one walking into a trap of my own making. By the time we reached the station, the weight of the situation was beginning to gnaw at me, though I couldn't fully name it yet. Michael Reed sat quietly in the back seat of my cruiser, his wrists still bound by the handcuffs. He didn't say a word during the drive. But the silence wasn't empty. It was charged. Each second stretching out like an eternity. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, hoping to see some sign of nervousness or fear. But his expression remained calm, his gaze steady as he looked out the window at the passing streets. This wasn't how suspects usually behaved. Most would try to plead, argue, or fight back in some way. Reed didn't. His quiet composure unnerved me in a way I couldn't explain. When we arrived at the station, I parked the cruiser and stepped out, opening the door to pull him out. As he stepped onto the pavement, he adjusted his suit slightly, a small, automatic movement that only added to my irritation. He was too composed, too deliberate, as though he already knew how this would play out. Inside, the station bustled with its usual noise, officers typing at desks, the murmur of conversations, the occasional clatter of equipment. It was a rhythm I found comfort in, a reminder of my authority. But as I led Reed through the station, a few heads turned, their gazes lingering on him. They didn't say anything, but I could sense the questions hanging in the air. Who was this man in the expensive suit, walking so calmly despite the cuffs on his wrists? Sergeant Mayers, my direct superior, stepped out of his office just as I was heading toward the booking area. His sharp eyes landed on Reed, then shifted to me. There was something unreadable in his expression, curiosity, perhaps, or suspicion. "What's going on here?" Mayers asked, his voice low but firm. "Routine stop," I replied, keeping my tone casual. Guy was acting suspicious, resisting. Figured I'd bring him in for questioning. Mayers's gaze flicked back to Reed, who stood silently, his hands still cuffed. There was no fear in his expression, no defensiveness. Instead, there was a quiet authority that seemed to unsettle even Mayers. "He doesn't look like he's resisting," Mayers said, his eyes narrowing slightly. And what exactly was suspicious about him? The question caught me off guard. Mayers rarely questioned my decisions. But there was something about this situation that seemed to unsettle him. I bristled, feeling my authority slipping under his scrutiny. He wasn't answering my questions, I said defensively. He was evasive. Mayers frowned, clearly unconvinced. "Make sure you handle this by the book," he said sharply. "No cutting corners." I nodded, though my irritation was mounting. I didn't need Mayers breathing down my neck, second-guessing my decisions. I led Reed to a holding cell, locking him inside before heading back to my desk to complete the paperwork. But even as I tried to focus, a knot of unease began to form in my stomach. Something about this wasn't right, though I refused to admit it. In the holding cell, Reed sat quietly, his hands resting in his lap. He wasn't worried, he was waiting. And though I didn't realize it yet, the storm was already beginning to build. The station's atmosphere had taken on an unusual tension. Though I tried to ignore it, I focused on filling out the paperwork, meticulously entering the details of the stop and arrest. The clatter of keyboards and muffled voices filled the air. Yet every so often, I caught a glance from a fellow officer. Their curiosity burned into me, though no one said anything outright. I told myself it didn't matter. I had followed protocol, or so I thought. Sergeant Mayers, however, wasn't letting this go. I could feel his presence looming, his sharp eyes watching everything with a scrutiny I hadn't encountered before. He called me into his office, his tone brisk and commanding. "What exactly happened back there?" he asked, his voice carrying a weight that made my defenses rise. "He was driving slowly through the neighborhood," I said. "Didn't seem like he belonged. When I pulled him over, he gave me attitude. He resisted." Mayers sat back, his expression hardening. "Resisted? Or just didn't respond the way you wanted?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the words stuck. Mayers leaned forward, his elbows on his desk, staring me down. "Listen, Davis. We can't afford mistakes right now. The department's already under fire for complaints of racial profiling. If this blows up, we're all going to feel the heat." I followed the rules. I shot back, though the tremor in my voice betrayed my growing unease. Mayers didn't look convinced. Instead, he sighed and gestured toward the monitor displaying the live body cam feeds. "Sit," he ordered. Reluctantly, I sank into the chair as Mayers pulled up the footage from my stop with Reed. My stomach tightened as I watched the scene unfold. The confrontation replaying in stark, undeniable detail. My voice, sharp and commanding. Reed's calm, steady responses. The moment I demanded he step out of the car. The way I cuffed him, despite his complete compliance. Mayers paused the video, his jaw clenched. This is what you call resisting? Because it looks to me like you escalated this for no reason." Before I could respond, a commotion from the booking area caught our attention. We both stood and headed toward the noise. As we approached, I saw a man in a sharp suit stride into the station, his expression one of steely determination. It took me a moment to recognize him as James Walters, a prominent attorney whose face had appeared on news programs discussing high-profile cases. He stopped in front of the holding cell where Reed Saturday Judge Reed, Walters said, his voice carrying an air of authority. "Are you all right, Judge?" The word hit me like a thunderclap. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just heard. Mayers turned to me, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Judge Michael Reed?" Mayers asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You arrested Judge Michael Reed?" I couldn't speak. My mouth went dry, my heart pounding in my chest. The weight of my actions came crashing down on me, and for the first time, I realized the depth of my mistake. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning and the clicking of Walter's polished shoes on the tiled floor. Judge Reed remained composed, seated in the holding cell, his calm demeanor unchanged. He nodded once to Walters, acknowledging his presence with the same quiet authority that had unnerved me during the stop. My heart pounded in my chest as the word judge echoed in my mind. I had just arrested a man who held more power than I could fathom, power that I had grossly underestimated. Mayers turned to me, his face pale, and his voice trembled with restrained anger. "You didn't check his ID properly, did you? You didn't even look at the name on his license." My words faltered. I hadn't. I'd glanced at the ID, barely registering it, too caught up in my assumptions and my need to assert control. Walter's sharp tone cut through my thoughts. "Sergeant Mayers," he said, turning toward my superior, "I trust this is a mistake that will be rectified immediately. Judge Reed has been treated with nothing short of abuse. And the entire ordeal is captured on that body cam footage. Mayers looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of seconds. He nodded stiffly. Of course. Mr. Walters. We'll handle this. As Walters pressed further, Mayers signaled for one of the officers to unlock the holding cell. The clinking of keys and the creak of the cell door reverberated through the room. Judge Reed stood slowly, brushing his suit jacket as though shaking off the indignity of the experience. For a moment, he turned his gaze toward me, his eyes locking with mine. You didn't see me, he said, his voice calm but cutting. You saw what you wanted to see. The weight of his words was like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. What could I say? How could I justify the decisions I'd made? As Reed and Walters walked out of the holding area, Mayers grabbed my arm, pulling me into his office. He shut the door behind us, his expression a storm of anger and disbelief. You've done it now, Davis, he said, his voice low but furious. Do you realize the disaster you've just created? This isn't just any mistake, you've humiliated one of the most respected judges in the state. I didn't know, I muttered weakly, but Mayers wasn't having it. That's the problem, he snapped. You didn't know because you didn't care to know. You saw a black man in a suit driving a nice car, and you decided he didn't belong. You let your ego and your prejudice blind you. And now this department is about to pay for it. I felt the floor fall out from under me. Mayers wasn't wrong. My chest tightened, my mind racing as the implications of my actions began to sink in. My career, my reputation, it was all slipping away. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. As the door to Mayers' office closed, the walls seemed to press in on me. Mayers paced back and forth, his frustration palpable. His words cut through me like a blade. Davis, this isn't just a screw-up. This is catastrophic. Do you realize how much damage you've done? I tried to form a coherent response, but my voice cracked under the weight of my guilt. I thought he was acting suspicious. I thought. Mayers stopped dead in his tracks, his glare cutting through my feeble defense. You thought. You didn't think. Davis. You acted on bias and arrogance. You saw someone who didn't fit your narrow expectations of who belongs in that neighborhood, and you let that cloud your judgment. I sat down heavily in the chair across from his desk, my hands trembling. I didn't know he was a judge. I whispered, as though that fact could absolve me of what I had done. That doesn't matter, Mayers bellowed, slamming his hand on the desk. It shouldn't have mattered if he was a judge, a teacher, or a garbage collector. You didn't treat him like a person. And now this department is in deep water because of you. The weight of his words hit me like a ton of bricks. He was right. It shouldn't have mattered who Marcus Reed was. But now that it did, I could feel the noose tightening around my neck. The station was buzzing outside the office. Word had spread quickly about the fiasco, and it was clear that the atmosphere had shifted. Officers who had once nodded in solidarity with me now avoided my gaze, their silence heavy with judgment. The door to Mayers' office opened, and Chief Harris stepped in. His face was a mask of barely contained fury. Davis, he said, his tone icy. I've just been informed about the full extent of your actions. Do you have any idea what you've done to this department? I rose to my feet, but my legs felt like lead. Chief. I didn't. Harris held up a hand to cut me off. Save it. You've humiliated this department on a national stage. The video of your stop is already going viral. And the media is having a field day. Protests are forming outside as we speak. My stomach churned. Protests? The thought of crowds gathering outside, chanting for my resignation, or worse, was almost too much to bear. Effective immediately. Harris continued. You are suspended pending a full investigation. Turn in your badge and gun. Those words felt like a death sentence. I unclipped my badge and holstered my gun, placing them on the desk with trembling hands. Harris didn't even glance at them. His focus was on Mayers, who nodded grimly. As I walked out of the office, the eyes of my colleagues followed me, their judgment heavy in the air. Outside, the noise of the protest was growing louder. I caught snippets of their chants, "Justice for Reed" and "End police brutality," echoing through the streets. I had thought myself untouchable. But now, I was drowning in the consequences of my actions. As I stepped out of the station, the cacophony of voices hit me like a tidal wave. The chants were relentless. The signs held high above the crowd's heads, stark reminders of my actions: "Justice for Reed," "No more abuse of power." The faces in the crowd were a sea of emotion: anger, grief, frustration. I kept my head low, avoiding eye contact. But their voices followed me like shadows. The walk to my car felt like an eternity. My world, once so certain, was crumbling beneath me. I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I stared ahead, but my mind replayed the events of the past 24 hours on a relentless loop. How had I let it come to this? What had I been trying to prove? As I drove home, the streets of Edgewood felt unfamiliar, as though they had turned against me. Every stoplight, every crosswalk, seemed to hold the weight of judgment. I avoided the news stations on the radio, but even the silence was deafening. It was filled with the echoes of my mistakes, the harsh reality of what I had become. When I finally reached my driveway, Emily was waiting on the porch. Her face was pale, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't say anything as I walked up the steps, but the look in her eyes said enough. She had been watching the news. She had seen the footage. She had seen me. I stood there, fumbling for words. "Emily, She cut me off, her voice quiet but firm. "What were you thinking? Davis? How could you let this happen?" I thought I started. But the words felt hollow. Even to me. I didn't know he was a judge. I didn't. "That's the problem," she snapped, her voice rising. "It shouldn't have mattered who he was. You treated him like a criminal because he didn't fit your idea of who belonged in that neighborhood. Do you even hear yourself?" Her words were like a mirror, reflecting every ugly truth I had tried to ignore. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," I said weakly. "I didn't know. You didn't think." "Davis," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "You didn't see him as a person. And now look where we are." I sank down onto the porch steps, burying my head in my hands. She sat beside me, the silence stretching between us like an unbridgeable chasm. "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "I feel like everything is falling apart." Emily exhaled slowly, her voice softer now. "You have to face this, Davis. All of it. The department can't protect you anymore. And honestly, I don't think they should." Her words stung. But they were true. The badge that had once felt like a shield now felt like a weight, dragging me down. I had believed it would protect me, but now it was clear that it couldn't protect me from myself. As the protests outside the station grew louder, Marcus Reed sat in his chambers at the courthouse, a quiet sanctuary compared to the chaos engulfing the city. The events of the past days had thrust him into the spotlight in ways he had never anticipated. He had always been a man of action, fighting for justice from the bench. But now his name was a rallying cry for change. The weight of it all settled heavily on his shoulders as he sifted through legal documents with his attorney, Jonathan Mitchell, sitting across from him. "Marcus," Mitchell began, his tone calm but urgent. "The protests are reaching a fever pitch. The public isn't just angry, they're demanding systemic reform. This is bigger than you now." Marcus nodded, his hands clasped tightly. "I know, Jonathan. I've spent my career fighting for fairness in the courtroom. And now I've experienced firsthand what so many have told me. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been stopped, questioned, or humiliated because of how they look." Mitchell leaned forward. "The question is, what do you want to do? The department is on the ropes. They've suspended Davis. But the public wants more. They want accountability, reform. Marcus stood, walking to the window. From his office, he could see the edge of the gathering crowd outside the courthouse. Their chants were faint but carried the weight of their demand for justice. "I want change, Jonathan," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Real change. I'm tired of words. I'm tired of promises that amount to nothing. We need reforms, body cameras, bias training, civilian oversight. This can't keep happening." Mitchell smiled faintly. "You're turning this into something powerful. But it's going to be a fight. Marcus. The department isn't going to roll over easily." Marcus turned back to him, his resolve clear. "I'm ready for that fight." Meanwhile, outside, the energy was electric. Protesters held signs aloft, their messages piercing: no more police brutality, justice for Reed, and end racial profiling. Among the sea of faces were families, students, community leaders, all united by a shared sense of outrage. It wasn't just Marcus's story that had ignited their passion, it was the countless untold stories that mirrored his experience. At the station, Chief Harris stared out the window, his face etched with worry. Inside, the tension among the officers was palpable. Sergeant Mayers approached him with a grim expression. "Chief, it's not just the protests. The media is tearing us apart. The DOJ has launched an inquiry, and the mayor is demanding answers." Harris sighed deeply, his hands pressed against his desk. "We're not just dealing with Davis anymore. This is about the entire department. We have to show the public we're serious." "And Davis?" Mayers asked. Harris's gaze darkened. "He's the scapegoat for now. But this department has systemic issues. And if we don't fix them, this is only the beginning." Back at the courthouse, Marcus stepped out onto the steps, facing the sea of protesters. Their cheers swelled as they saw him. For the first time, he raised a hand to address them, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "This isn't just about me," he began. "This is about every person who has been wronged by a system that too often fails us. Today, we stand together, not just for justice, but for change. And we won't stop until we achieve it."